But thank you. We did get an email sent out this past week, so hopefully that reminded you and things like that.
And
Or
it was
just
on Facebook too.
word of mouth and things like that. So thank goodness for social media, right, when the snail mail doesn't work. Debbie?
And if anybody did not get an email, if you'll see me after the meeting, I can make sure I have your address correct or that I have it at all.
Yes, thank you. And don't know if you noticed in, was it September's, maybe October's Chamber Chatter, but we now have a spot in the Chamber Chatter to talk about the Montevallo Historical Society or the history of Montevallo. And Marty Evers has agreed to write that, so you can always figure there's going to be some sometimes more obscure history than we know. Marty's good at kind of ferreting that out, and usually at least some type of a dry humor involved or something like that. So hopefully you'll enjoy those things as well. Janice, is it this month or next month that we have the announcements for holiday happenings in the Chamber Chapel?
It will be coming up in November.
In November. Okay, so the next issue should have a full page spread and then a reminder at the bottom that it's time to renew memberships in the Montevallo Historical Society. And also they'll be listing some upcoming holiday happenings, and we're trying to work on maybe some type of house or architectural tour along Shelby Street to look at some of the homes, maybe get inside the Presbyterian Church to see how that rebuilding has gone.
Looks great.
Good.
The stained glass won't be until the end of December.
Okay, and I'm sure they would appreciate, hey, if you just want to go on Sunday morning, contribute to the offering plate, all that kind of stuff, get sprinkled, do whatever, have that whole experience. There you go. Do that. Speaking of membership renewal, I actually mentioned that in my president's letter, in the newsletter that nobody got. But when I wrote that to meet the press time, some things were still in flux. But anyway, I was saying, hey, oh, by the way, membership renewal time is coming up. We will send reminders to you, email and probably snail mail as well. So do that. And just so you know, if you joined us early, so before July 1st of this year, then you're going to get a renewal notice. If you joined us after July 1st, then we're just going to consider that your 2018-2019 membership, okay? But again, if you would just like to send money so that we can do some of these programs and things like that, that would help. But membership dues are funding the newsletter and the postage, and then we're trying to look to some other things. I will tell you this, we highlighted the Sailor House and the Calkins House and some of the preservation efforts, or some of the, the rumors were going around that some demolition projects might be in store. I talked with Dr. John Stewart in the last quarter, and he assured me that there are no plans by the university to tear down either of those structures at this point. They actually had done some studies on, okay, what are the various prospects, and come up with 4 different courses of action, but certainly preservation would be preferable. Restoration, because they are in bad shape and need some restoration and some refurbishing to be usable. And with that, in the conversation, we at least have those communication lines open. But it occurred to me that it would help if we, as members of the community, as the Montevallo Historical Society, if we're going to promote the preservation of our historic homes, then we probably need a little bit more skin in the game than just saying, oh no, don't do that. So I will tell you, I'm trying to set the example as the president of the organization, so I have already renewed my membership for 2019, and I included a little bit of seed money in there for what we will call our Places in Peril Fund, our preservation fund, so that if some of these issues come up and we feel like there's some preservation that needs to be done, then hopefully we can cooperate with other folks, similar to what the university and the city and the county have done in combining some resources to do some of the things in town, at the university, at the American Village and things like that. Then maybe we too can contribute at least part of that to say, hey, we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. So we have started that, and I base that on something that Reverend Robert Moore told me when he was back in town for a Baptist church reunion one time, and I had forgotten this, but he said, when you were a young teenager, I guess maybe 13 or 14, people started talking about having a church bus to go on, to retreats and things like that, or to pick up college students, bring them to church. And so everybody was talking about that, but we didn't have a bus fund. So he told me then, he says, you probably don't, and I did not, but anyway, apparently I gave $5 to start the bus fund at Ohio First Baptist Church. And lo and behold, some other folks who had more than $5, more than I did, contributed, and we ended up with the church bus, and were able to use it. So I'm trying to provide, I gave more than $5, but anyway, have tried to do a little seed money in there so that we can contribute to some of the preservation efforts if and when necessary. I also mentioned there that that approval from the IRS for our 501c3 status was imminent. About a week after I sent that to Clay and he sent it to press, we got the official letter from the IRS. They had asked for some additional information. We answered that, and so we got notification of the approval of the 501c3. So we are now an official nonprofit organization. So any of those donations that you make and your membership, whatever, you can deduct those from your income tax. So that helps on that end as well. So it's nice to have this October meeting. Nice that the weather cooperated. It feels like fall, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a nice little reprieve from the hot summer. And it's nice to have this as our 4th quarterly meeting of 2018, which finishes out our first year of having these community meetings. So thank you for your participation and for all the encouragement and support that you have given us. Our next meeting is scheduled for January 20th, 2019. So we'll be looking forward to that new year and another great year of history. Also, I'll mention to you, our resources, our treasury is doing well. Janice gave me the total there, $4,288.61. So we can continue with the newsletter for now, and then also perhaps, and plus start of the Places in Peril Fund. So we will continue to keep you updated there. So thanks for your participation. Thanks for being here. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers, Carrie Heatherly and Clark Hultquist, two of my colleagues at the University of Montevallo. Carrie is the archivist working in Carmichael Library, has done a lot, frankly, to open up the archives there at the university. If you visited there in the old days, everything was back in the corner. You kind of go pilfering through. We called it dabbling in documents, although we weren't really dabbling. We were just looking at them, and dusting off documents or something like that. Occasionally a student would get in there and find something to do a senior thesis on it or something like that. But Carrie has brought the professionalism of an archivist to that. We now have a designated archives, filing those. We still have students who are working there to assist him in organization with finding aids and that type of thing, and able to tap those resources and learn more about that university and about the towns. Some digitization projects as well, and Clay's been working with him there with some old newspapers, which is what they're going to focus on today. He and Clark worked to, of course, do the Arcadia Publishing Company's book on Montevallo, looking at those old pictures, providing the captions and the research there, and they used the archives. Clark not only is my colleague in history, but also my office neighbor. And I was thinking down here about what I could say about him, and the best thing I can say is I had an opportunity back in the late summer to move to a larger office, and I declined because I liked my neighborhood. And, so, Clark, for better or worse, man, you have me. I'm sticking around. But Clark has done work in French advertising, and so he was sending me all kinds of newspaper clippings this week. He was focusing on the advertisements and things like that. It's interesting. Some of these flash in the pan kind of things. And in fact, he sent me one that was intrigued us both. And I was mentioning to a couple of folks that didn't know about this. Is the I don't want to steal your thunder, so interrupt me if I am. Briarfield Normal College. Yeah. Who knew? I didn't. But anyway, knew about the 6 Mile Academy, but did not know about the Briarfield Normal College. And it says, and it talks about it says, for more information, contact the president, who is a man named Collier, or the vice president, who is W.A. Gibbon. And I said, W.A. Gibbon? That's my great uncle. So Renee's the genealogist guru in our family, so I sent it to her and says, hey, is this our Uncle Gibbon, which was kind of interesting because my dad lived with him and his mother's sister, Aunt Annie, up in the west end of Birmingham when he was going to Howard when it was in Eastlake. So he'd ride the streetcar back and forth, was the executor of Aunt Annie's will and estate and whatever, and they called him Uncle Gibbon as opposed to using his first name, which was kind of interesting. But I said, hey, my great uncle, so there you go. So thank y'all for opening the archives. Thank you for being here. And I know you'll do a much better job about talking about those things. So Carrie and Clark, welcome.
I know as handsome as I am, I'm going to be blocking the screen. So, the title of our presentation is somewhat misleading. I'm going to talk. How many of you are familiar with our digital holdings? Okay, a little over half. Good. Some of this will be new. Some of it will be a rehash. I'm going to talk a little bit about our digital holdings, what we've done, where we are, and what we're going to do in the very near future. And then I'm going to turn it over to Clark, and Clark's got the newspaper perspective. I'll jump in occasionally with what lies I know. But Clark looks at these a little differently than we do. He looks at them through the lens of a scholar, so he has a really unique take on a lot of these things. And the old archives in the library, if you've ever been to it, was so bad it is now the restrooms. Okay, this is our most recent addition to the university's library. How many of you know Pat? She's a class of 66 alum, and Pat, in her professional life, was a school librarian for the Governor's School in Greenville, South Carolina. And she's one of those people who, in her retirement, became far more busy than she ever was during her career. And she has since become a book editor and an intellectual freedom expert. So when you hear of school systems, there's a book challenge at a school system, some concerned parent or whatever, she is the person that the American Library Association relies on for her expertise. And in worst case scenarios, they fly her in as the expert witness if the thing goes to trial. But a lot of the publishing houses, especially the big ones in New York City, if they anticipate that a book might have a problem, might be controversial in some way, they'll go ahead and send her a copy of it for her to review so she can sort of pre-game any problems. They can make any last-minute changes before they produce it. As a result, she has this wonderful collection of signed first edition copies of children's and young adult books, which we now have. And she's donated over 10,000 items so far, but we have built a room to house the main portion of the special collections that she's donated, which is about 3,500 signed first edition children's books, interactive books. Those are pop-up books. And these aren't the pop-up books you get at Walmart. These are pop-up books done by artists. Some of them are really spectacular. There's all sorts of dolls that go along with this. I like all the Dr. Seuss dolls, all the Hardy Boys figures, that sort of thing. And in her archival holdings, she has correspondence with many of these people. She just had lunch with Lois Lowry last week, who wrote The Giver. So what we have done with the room, or what we are planning to do with the room, we're teaching a banned books class for the Honors Department in the spring of 2018. But the College of Education, English, other honors courses, the art department, they all have interest in these types of materials. And some of the projects that we're kicking around that we're talking about doing is interactive calendars for school use, electronic teacher's guides, the 2D and 3D virtual curated art displays. And this is an example of, because not everything controversial has to do with text, but this is one of the images that we've been really studying, and I think it's pretty stark. The Duliers, a couple who wrote children's biographies back in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is their book about Abraham Lincoln. And you can see visually how things have changed over time. It's kind of hard to see, but if you notice in the original 1939 edition, African Americans in the background have no faces. And if you'll notice, the next one over, the 57, I don't expect you to be able to see it, but they have faces in 57, but they're the caricature kind of Aunt Jemima stereotype. And then the 2015, they look like African Americans actually look. So this is sort of a sample of what we're trying to accomplish with the room, what we're trying to do. And some of this stuff, hopefully in the coming semesters, will be digitized by our students. And one of the things we do with these materials is we try to get students involved in them, classes involved with them doing these digital projects. Can you bump out to the... Yeah. Pat Scales' room has its own webpage. We also are taking donations, so if you have some of those old books that might be significant in some way, the guidelines for what we're looking for are also on this page. I'll show you where all this lives at the end. But if you could go one tab over. Oh, at the very top, when it says digital collections. All the way at the top. Sorry, I thought I was going to be able to drive from up here. So, our digital projects, thus far, we've been working on them for about 9 or 10 years. We have the yearbooks from the university from 1907 to 2010 updated, scanned, digitized, they're online, ready for use. We are currently working to update those to the most recent yearbook. And I'll show you a photo in a second. The 1921 yearbook, if you don't know about it, has one of the earliest campus town histories in it, and it was written by the first historian hired at the university in 1896. Another image I'll show you in a second is in the backs of the yearbooks, there are ads, and they're really great photos of town. Course catalogs and bulletins. We have our course catalogs and bulletins from, if you'll go one tab over, from 1896. Oh yeah, here's the yearbook holdings. If you go one more over. Course catalogs and bulletins. They publish bulletins 4 times a year. The course catalog being one of them. The other 3, they usually have some kind of general interest topic that they used it for. We'll talk about World War I after a while, but October 1917, the girls at the school headed up an effort to create a cookbook, and they had recipes submitted from other girls' technical and industrial schools at the time on how to, for instance, bake a wedding cake with no sugar, no eggs, things that would have been rationed or things that would have been prioritized for the military at the time, a little harder to get a hold of. Its subtitle is Food Savings Hints, Recipes Using Substitutes for Sugar, Meat, Wheat, and Fat. And one of my students cooked the wedding cake, and it was not as bad as I was expecting. Lydia got me. So if we go one more over, this is another one of our bulletins, and I love it because it is menus. You can see exactly what the girls had: breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all during, and then they're dated. But there's a search inside function at the top. So once you open an item, for instance, if you open a yearbook, if you know the name of the person you're searching for, you can search it and it'll drop a pin everywhere that person is mentioned. Also, you have a lot of tools toward the bottom. And could you tab over a couple of pages? Oh. Go back one tab. I'm sorry. Down here at the bottom, after it says 16. Yeah, flip a couple more. Yeah, so you can see what days they had cereal, which days they had lunch that incorporated mayonnaise. That sort of thing. So there's really cool. We do a lot with food on campus because we have the farm and the dairy, so students are really interested in that sort of thing. The Alabamian, the student newspaper from 1924 to the mid-1980s, is also linked to our website. It's full of great information. I did a project for the Library of Congress and the National Park Service a couple of years ago and used the student newspaper quite a bit because the young ladies were writing editorials and complaints about how nasty it was on campus because the dirt was getting everywhere. When it rained, it was muddy. So that sort of kicked off the effort to try and brick and pave sidewalks and streets. If you could go back to the presentation. Here's an example of some of the photographs you'll find in the 1921 Technolo. That's the one with the history in it. I know it's hard to see. It's really hard to see in the actual yearbook itself. It's almost 100 years old, so I cut it a little bit of a break. But you can see the car parked here in front of Main Street. You can also see the mansion house as it's referred to in 1921. And I assume y'all all know what that is now. King House on campus. So this is what it looked like when we purchased it from the neighbor's family in 1908. I used that house as an example because students come with this idea that it's the King House. It's always been the King House. It was referred to as the Mansion House, Neighbors Hall, the infirmary. It was the offices for the psychology department at one point. It was also the home ec house. So.
A bunch of us had to go take tests there for psychology if you were in school at the elementary school.
Right. After World War II, they housed men in there because we had to take a certain number of men, even though we were a women's school, to fulfill the GI Bill quota. And then they started talking about, hey, these guys have money and can pay. It still took them nearly a decade to take them. This is the 1954 montage, and this is the first page indicating that you're entering the area of the yearbook full of advertisements. As you can see, there probably were a lot of sick people here because here's 2 of the 3 drugstores that was on Main Street. But this is I like this one. But if you flip through these, great shots of town. Some places in town, the only photos that we have of them. So we're going to start talking a little bit more about newspapers now, but the Matt Wyatt Digital Archive, and if you want to step out to that page. So what we're doing here is we're providing online access to a lot of different town, local, county, area newspapers. The Union Banner in Clanton is one of our most recent additions, which the Historical Society down there is thrilled about because they're in the planning stages of their sesquicentennial. But the primary focus of the project are the newspapers that were published by Matt Wyatt. If you scroll down just a tad bit, you can see some guy, I don't know if you know him or not, deserves a special thanks for this. This is a project of largely his doing, and we're grateful for it. You just scroll down the page. There we go. See Matt with George Wallace. You can see the newspapers listed here that we've done. We've got newspapers going back to the 1890s up to circa 1950. Our next batch of newspapers that we're gonna send off, we're gonna send Montevallo Times from the early 1950s, also the Shelby County Times Herald from 1954 to 1959. And we're gonna also focus on filling the rest of the gaps with our Union banner. And you can click on them there, you can search them, but we've pulled things out into slides, so maybe we won't have to bounce back as much anymore. If you could go back to the presentation. So this is one, if you've heard me speak before, I pulled this one out a lot. This is one that Clark found about a decade ago now. And we kind of made a note of it and set it aside. Montevallo murder. Walter S. Carey, attorney, was shot and killed Friday evening by Frank Coyle. I get in trouble for saying that.
Corral.
Everybody, yeah, livery man. An altercation arose over a lawsuit against one Garner by the
Corrals.
Carey defending Garner. Upon their return from Calera, where the case was tried,
Corral.
and Carey had a dispute in which a shooting occurred. Later, Mr. Carey was shot twice with a double-barrel shotgun, the gun tearing a great hole, striking him in the head. Mr. Carey fell. Frank
Corral.
then ran up and shot him through the head. Mr.
Corral.
made his escape. Mr. Carey died an hour later. He was one of the most prominent lawyers in this section. Mr.
Corral.
son of George, largest merchant in this part of the country. Mr. Carey leaves 6 orphan children, his wife having died July last. This happened December 14th, 1901 on Main Street. And this is the local paper. The Montgomery Advertiser picked it up the next day and ran the story. But we filed this away. We've got photographs of Main Street. We kind of think we know about where this happened. Last time, if you'll step out to the last tab on the browser. The court case went all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court, and the reports of one morning. The one that says reports.
Probably 2 to the left.
Yeah. Yeah, so this made it all the way to Alabama Supreme Court. Frank pled homicidal insanity, what they called it, in 1904 when the case was finally settled. And he didn't do much in the way of time. You know, but the full account, if you read the court case, the full account is apparently Carey also had a pistol, and he yelled at Frank, and Frank dropped him with a double-barrel shotgun and then ran up and gave him the coup de grace with a 38. It gets really detailed.
Sleepy little town.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to let Clark dive off into his specialty.
Kind of felt like I was Vanna White over there, though I didn't go up with my hands. I probably should have done that. So, Clay, we'll get ready to start with back to the presentation. And so, Jim Day's been very patient this past week. I'm not sure he actually wants to be my neighbor anymore, because I was preparing this the last couple of weeks. I was just looking, finding things, and I was just so excited. So he's seen about 1 out of 4, and he's seen others that just did, they're on the cutting room floor. So anyway, thank you for your patience. And I was talking to Jim McDonald just right before we started. I'm a historian, as if you didn't know that, some of you may not. And I'm just happier than a pig in mud looking at this old media, either newspapers or magazines. And then just want to thank Clay again for the funding for the digitization, because it was just so easy. I mean, it's almost criminally easy. No reference to Carey and Crowell sort of incident, but it's just so easy to use this. So if you have not used these yet, it's just fantastic just to sit from my desk and be able to scan through years and years of these newspapers and really gain a sort of impressionistic overview of Montevallo. And so, as Jim said, my interest is advertising history, and the advertising historian Roland Marchand likes to look at advertisements. His metaphor is that they're a Zerkspiegel, and that's a fancy German word for a distorting funhouse mirror. So ads never really show the reality of society. It sort of shows it's like a funhouse mirror, sort of hopes and dreams, things sort of that we want to be like, and maybe we never are. But also, besides this sort of funhouse mirror, there is a sense of realism, because ads really show, and what I'm really going to be focusing on are local ads. I'm not using really almost any national branded ads. What Montevallans could have had, what they could have bought, what they could have purchased, what the material culture that people at least had potential to buy. And so I have 3 rough periods, because I didn't want to make this 3 hours. I'm sure you're relieved about that. So I'm going to look at the Montevallo News in about a 2.5-year period. I think I have 15 sort of advertisement slides. And then the Montevallo Advertiser, 1917 and 1919. And then the Montevallo Times, 1933 to 1935. And I kind of see these as sort of levels of development. And as we'll see some of these as the late 1890s. And I took out some things like patent medicine ads that you'll really see a lot in the 1890s, a few in the teens, not so many in the 30s, but sort of ladders of development that in the late 1890s, one really gets a sense of rural town, certainly serviced by the railway, but some road transportation, but it really was a sort of local community. General stores, in some sense, predominated in terms of a lot of the ads, and I have some ads, and Carrie's going to provide some editorial gloss there. Then the 19-teens, you see a sort of step up. You see some ads for automobile dealers, but from what I could tell, there weren't any in Montevallo, but they're nearby, and I think the ad I have is from Calera, but you do see an auto repair store in Montevallo in 1919. And then, and this is some teasers here, but we'll see a sort of Nickelodeon type theater in terms of amusements and just some other things. And the nature of the general stores seem to change a little bit, as we'll see in some examples. And then the 1930s, I'm really excited. It's almost full-blown consumer culture. And I'm team teaching our class with Dr. Sanders. I'll shout out to him. And in terms of what we call the second industrial revolution, we see 2 things. Mass production and mass distribution come to Montevallo in the 1930s. And what's amazing, this is the Great Depression. But we certainly see there is availability for people to buy things. Maybe they're not buying things, but at least we see advertisements. So that's my sort of overview. And as we look at some of these ads, if anyone wants to say anything, this is not formal, because there may be things, oh, that's my great-grandparents' store. There may be some anecdote, because believe me, my level of knowledge, did I say this, is about this deep. But I know about advertising history, but at times I may not know in great depth Montevallo history. And so I'm using this on purpose, because I just liked it. It's Montevallo, the hustling, the bustling, the rustling, the most enterprising little city in the state.
Yeah.
She offers the best chances for an education. She has the best female college in the South. Go. If you want an education, she offers the best. If you want a home, she cannot be beat. Her people are the kindest and the best. We want all good people to come and live with us. So thank you. So I did this on purpose because I knew this audience would fit the bill. And so occasionally you would see, and the newspaper placed this itself. This wasn't, I think, a ad in terms of the town itself. And then of course there's a famous local entrepreneur and also university president. And
Yeah.
again, this is where I'll hand off to Mr. Heatherly here.
Also owns the Montevallo News. H.C. Reynolds, obviously the state's only licensed back guano dealer. But if you get into some of the early university history, he's president for 3 years. And at that time, when you're president, as long as you're not invited to leave, you get your contract renewed every year. Well, at the end of his 3rd year, he was invited to leave. And the university had a case against him in which he was requiring the young ladies to purchase certain things like materials for their uniforms, typewriters, that sort of thing from their store. Their store happened to be the only store in town that carried that kind of whatever. But as we were digging deeper, he was only being paid about half of his salary. So I'm sure this was a way in which he was trying to recoup some of his costs. And he had been to Washington, D.C. to lobby for us and for the Tuskegee Institute land grants, land for the university's disposal and use for funding. And he incurred about $500 on the 2.5-week trip, and neither Tuskegee nor our institution reimbursed him for it. $500 in 1899 is a chunk of change. So there was a court case that got settled in Calera, 1901, 1902 was when it happened, but it was sort of the he said, the institution said kind of thing. His son was involved in it as well because he's co-owner of the newspaper and co-owner of the store.
And you built my house.
Briggs, yes. The really scandalous thing, which he was invited to leave over, was as they were building a phase of Main Hall, he happened to have $250,000 bricks he could get for them on the cheap. And they were like, he ordered a dozen pianos for the music program, and 11 went to the school, and 1 went to his home, which is where CBS is now. His second and third wives were both musicians.
See, he provides all the fun stuff. So, thank you. And so, a competitor, attention young ladies, as our order has gone forth, you are not allowed to buy your uniform from us. Well, Barry just explained why. So, first class dry goods, notions, ribbons, fancy goods and velvets, a beautiful line of shoes that will bear inspection and please you. We like your trade and promise genteel and courteous treatment, but coerce no one to trade with us. So what's interesting is that they're advertising in Reynolds newspaper, so even if they're critical of Reynolds, they're actually paying an advertising rates there.
Also, C.L. Maroney is a trustee of the school. He's one of the original trustees of the school, so in a sense, his boss.
So anyway, fun times that one didn't know about. How do you pronounce this? I can't remember. Yeah, no, I knew, but just having fun. So anyway, the possums. Of course, some of these, in terms of my eyes, are hard to read. We got them, and sorry, Carrie. We have a full line of dry goods, dress goods, and notions of the greatest variety and finest kinds. And so again, this goes back to sort of my earlier statement of the type of general store. So despite the size of the livery stable, and was that kind of where the Subway is or McDonald's?
Yeah, that area.
So, and so I'm not really necessarily sure where their general merchandise store, if that was right next door or not, but
Correll's livery stable was by his house, which is was where University on Main was. And there are pictures in the tavern that showed
Yeah.
when the livery stable was there. But
And
it was
so-
there till late.
we see just a variety, a number of sort of Maroney, Crowell, Reynolds in terms of the type of sort of traditional general stores for this era. That there's probably some distribution from Birmingham or Montgomery or maybe Selma in terms of the raw materials, and then they sort of repurpose them, or at least some of them, at these general stores. If you're not sweet, get sweet by buying your candies, fruits, nuts, cakes from F.W. Rogan, peanut brittle, and a fresh lot of grapes. I don't know, something you want to talk about that with Rogan?
Yeah, so one of the things about Rogan, Reynolds, Maroney, they're all in business together. They all know each other really well. Rogan and the Reynolds, they're kin by marriage. One of the other things I really like about this ad too is for a time, Rogan also embalmed bodies. So you can buy your candy and get embalmed after you use it.
Speaking of bricks, we don't know if this is Reynolds or where he got his bricks or just a competitor. Do you want bricks? Well, we make them. Banks Brothers handmade bricks are the best on the market. We all kinds of brickwork and always keeps lime, cement, and sand. And so part of the reason I'm showing this as well in terms of the late 1890s as Montevallo infrastructure is being built up. So this is not necessarily the sort of sleepier town in the 1870s or the 1880s. And we certainly get a sense of, just even by having a newspaper, this is a different town than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And 20 years hence, when we get to 1917, 1919, you'll see even more example of infrastructure. And when was the first paving of the roads? 1905-ish or so? Or,
It was an attempt, yeah.
So this is sort of the sort of paving of Montevallo roads at this time. Do you meet? Yes. If so, you need good meat. You will find everything you need at the city market. You buy country produce in connection with our restaurant, meals at all hours. So I had not heard of this. I don't know. In a number of these instances, I would see these in the 1890s, and they no longer appeared 20 years later. So just like today, sometimes institutions might have a relatively short life expectancy. Similarly, the New York Racket Store. The enemy of credit system is a Montevallo. Call on him. He has for schoolgirls. I'm not going to try to read all these to you. So again, yet another general store-like competitors. I think at least we have 4 of these already. And I don't know, the town's population is at 2,000 or so, maybe at this time.
So not quite 2,000 at the time.
Yeah, so, but I think they seem to be fairly well served by these stores. No real reason other than just like the graphic image there. Thinking about Rogue and I.D. Hicks, the People's Undertaker, and Carrie noticed that the dollar sign is backwards. I don't know if that's a sort of wink at people or not. Anyway, it's quite stylish, certainly. Coffins and caskets, it's death is being democratized here, obviously. Spanish-American War, there was a number of articles, and they're sort of the equivalent of pre-Associated Press or Reuters, but this is actually just an advertisement for Morgan Brothers. So a well-armed man appears at the top. If you can't see, I think there's a knife in his mouth and various other gunpowder device weapons. A few of the things we'll need when we go to the War of Spain. So it's capitalizing upon the sort of militant nature of the United States in 1898. So Morgan Brothers is playing their part by keeping their prices low to help support our troops, I think, something like that. So they're the up-to-date merchants. Follow the crowd and we'll go to Morgan Brothers. And you will see, actually, they had several ads in a sort of series. I didn't want to show all 5 or 6, but this is sort of the best in terms of the Spanish-American War and trying to capitalize that in terms of sales. And this is the advertisement that Jim was mentioning earlier. And just because of pixelation issues, if I tried to make it any larger, it would be somewhat illegible. So Briarfield Normal College and Commercial Institute is not a university, nor is it the best school in the state. So underselling, maybe. I want you to be pleasantly surprised. It is simply a new institution designed to meet the demands of aspiring young people by giving them thorough training in all the ordinary courses. I can't read that. Cheaper than other schools of the grade. I'm not going to read the rest, other than I can see. Healthy location, splendid building, good social advantages, 5 instructors, very reasonable terms. And then Dr. Day's great uncle, W.A. Gibbon, and J.M. Collard, the president. And I don't really want to make light of the ad, but that certainly is saying something about Montevallo in the late 1890s. Not only do we have AGIS, but just nearby we have other institutions. And so again, we're thinking about the Second Industrial Revolution, and there's really a need for educated workers, clerical workers, teachers, people in commerce. And again, I'm pretty sure 1870 and 1880 you would not have seen as many, even though there were schools here, as we all know, long predating AGIS. I did just find this because I was, again, interested in looking. We were going to learn that there is some trouble existing between the trustees and the teachers of the Normal College. We have not learned the particulars, but hope all difficulties will be settled and this good school will go on as usual. Unfortunately, I could find nothing else about it because our run was only 1895 to 1899. And I don't know, are there even any other copies? Are they waiting to be digitized? Or do we know it just ceased publication?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, it didn't last.
So I might just rely upon any collective memory in the audience if anyone knows what happened to a Briarfield Normal School Institute. I don't think it's still here, obviously. I just wonder, did it last 2 or 3 years? Was it sort of fly-by-night?
That was when Briarfield was a real town. You can't see any of the
Right, I just wonder if even anywhere of the buildings for the school or building might still exist, so.
They say the foundations are there for Main Street along Briarfield.
So anyways, one of these things that are kind of very fascinating, sort of lost in time. And so we go 20 years later to the Montevallo Advertiser, 1917, 1919. And as a note, if for some reason anyone really wants to know the dates and exact pages, I have them of all of the advertisements. I just thought for a presentation, I just didn't want lots of text. And as a historian, I like to cite things and have exactly where they are. So if for some reason anyone really wants to know, I'd be happy to give you the exact dates and page numbers for them. And so I was talking to Kara right before the presentation, and so you may know during the ending part of the Great War in the United States, in some sense worldwide, because of so much of European agriculture is being disrupted, that even in the United States there was mild amount of food shortages. So there's government initiatives basically to be thrifty, to save, to plant more food, to grow more food. And in fact, I think it goes back to what you were mentioning about the cookbooks. And what was the sort of point about substitutions, that if we run out of certain materials,
Right. Rations.
you know, so that the cake recipe was saying. So this is W.L. Brown again. We must feed ourselves. The South must feed itself. Alabama must feed herself. We in Shelby, sorry, I can't read that. Should feed ourselves. Feed ourselves. Sorry about that. We in the Mono neighborhood should feed ourselves, but should have something to share for our neighbors. And so one of the local merchants, W.L. Brown, is posting that. Again, Maroney is still around 20 years later. General Lee said, sorry.
Duty is the sublimest word in our language.
Thank you. You're our interpreter. What is our duty now to serve our country? President Wilson says, I particularly appeal to farmers of the South to plant abundant foodstuffs. I can get that really easily. They show their patriotism in no better way. And so you'll see, not every ad, but several, 2 or 3 per issue, or even per page at times, are
But
really
remember, these
cognizant.
guys sold seed and fertilizer.
Yes, yes. Certainly.
But there's also another practical aspect to this as well, and it's really evidenced in the earliest presidential papers how hard it is to get massive amounts of food to town and get it from the depot all the way up to, especially to the university at the top of the hill. But also, this ad is 8, 9, 10 years after Theodore Roosevelt's presidency with the Pure Food and Drug Act and those sorts of things. And there are letters and correspondences, receipts, and that sort of thing in the presidential papers about how many shipments of food they got, and they opened the peaches and they had weevils in them, and the meat, the canned meat had maggots in it. It's not like you can just run to Walmart and buy enough to get you through to the next shipment gets here. You have to ship the stuff back. All the paperwork has to go through offices in Montgomery because we're a state school. So it's a very practical thing to be sort of green at that time.
Merchants and planters banks, and I do not think in the 1890s I'd seen ads for them. So I think during 1917 and 19, the first ads.
Yeah, they opened 1902.
Right. And so again, preparedness slogans. Where's Andrea? Why don't you do that for help?
Do your part in the war. Help Alabama raise foodstuffs. If you cannot enlist, plant something to eat. Raise what you eat. Something what you can. Can what you can.
Oh, can what you can.
Yeah.
As well. Okay.
Eat what you grow. Grow what you eat.
So anyway, it's your patriotic duty to grow something to eat. So I like this. Actually, I'm starting to get hungry. We have a reception afterwards, so we can think about that. Montevallo Ice and Light Company, a canning factory in Montevallo. It's more fortunate in this time of such scarcity of food. Montevallo's have a canning plant, and so again, you would not have seen this in the 1890s. That we're really starting to see more of an infrastructure, sort of like manufacturing, if you want to call it canning manufacturing, existing for Montevallo. So more things, more pieces in some sense are coming together. More, maybe these are too many, but Davies and Jeter Mercantile Company, women's clothing and basically fabrics on the left. And I went to an inflation CPI multiplier for prices. So in 1919, it's 15 to 1, so a dollar then is 15 times more if you just want to multiply to give you a sense of what the price was. And then Crowell, again, sorry, went the wrong way, in terms of their dry goods, dress goods for ladies. So certainly probably trying to capitalize upon AGTI at this time in terms of clientele. And this is what I mentioned earlier. So now we're starting to see the arrival of the automobile in Montevallo. So on the left was the automobile repairing that I had mentioned, W.T. Carpenter. And this was the only ad, at least I saw in those 2 years, nearby for automobile sales, the Wade Motor Company in Calera. And we'll see in the 1930s, there's quite a few local competitors. So the automobile has finally made its arrival in terms of advertisements in Montevallo media. Yes, this is a Ford, the old reliable Model T, obviously. Amusements, so Nickelodeon style theater, I imagine, the Amuse You Theater in Montevallo. I was able to look and find there are other Amuse You theaters in the state of Alabama. So I don't know if it was a chain or just sort of a trademark name that various similar type theaters use. So in some sense, a type of predecessors to the Strand. And so we certainly get a sense that there's a little bit of disposable income for people in town. And also the infrastructure is easier for people to gather in town, or certainly in the 1880s, perhaps not quite so much. And then this ad, I actually I cropped into 3 different ads just so we could see them a little bit easier here. So Saturday Hide and Seek Detectives was one of the films. And then Monday, Marguerite Clark and Little Miss Hoover. And so I had to look up this film, and what a surprise. I love IMDb. But the film description is, during World War I, Washington, D.C. society girl Nancy Craddock decides to enlist in the Food Administration on the theory that, quote, eggs will win the war. So yeah, I had no idea when I first saw this ad that this would connect to some of the other ads I was actually showing. And then Dorothy Gish in the Hope Chest. And then one last thing, I was looking up the Paramount logo that I think everyone recognized. That Paramount, and this ad's 1919, Paramount Theaters only started in 1917, so their logo was only 2 years old at that time. So I thought that was somewhat fascinating that the logo finds its way to Montevallo relatively soon after the company's incorporation. George Crowell starts to appear here more, and I'll let Carrie interpret this. We were talking about this right before the presentation. We found a better version of this in terms of legibility.
And you have it, don't you?
Yes, I do. Of course, I probably did it. Oh, here it is. So we see 2 types of wagons. On the left is sort of the newer modern wagon. On the right is sort of the older model. And so we're talking about farmers' wagons here.
Yeah, so apparently the U.S. government was making a push at the time to make the wheelbase on wagons more narrow by 4 inches to 56 inch, where the standard at the time had been 60 inches, in order so that wagons could pass through the tracks left by automobiles. And it's hard to see. This is a problem with working with newspapers. When you start blowing stuff up, it really starts pixelating quickly. But the wagon on the left, you'll see follows in the tracks, but the 60-inch wagon on the right is just wide enough that it straddles the tracks, and what happens is you get a little askew and you fall off and break your wagon axle and that sort of thing. So, and they have their reasoning, but he was really pushing, why would you not want to buy the wagon that the government says is best for you?
So I mean, I never knew this, and so I'm glad Carrie can, because I saw the ad, I just thought it was interesting, but I had no idea about sort of standardization in terms of the wagon industry during this era. And certainly we know that probably within 10, 20, 30 years, we're not going to see these wagons probably anymore. I'm sure locally they might be around, but not too many in terms of functional use as motorized trucks started to take over. So our last, and that's always nice hint. My students love that. They start packing up. But we still have about 10 slides here, the Montevallo Times. And so in these newspapers, and many in the audience, I'm glad that we're contemporaries. They know the term newspaper. If this were a younger audience, what's that? And I cry every day actually thinking about newspapers disappearing, and I get weepy about it. And so we'll start to see either ads or things that just, they look 1980-ish, 1990-ish. I'm not going to say today's newspapers, but they start to have more of a contemporary look to them, just 14 years after our previous examples. And so this is a ad published by the newspaper itself, starting the year right. Your hometown paper larger and more complete. And this is the first edition of this newspaper, 1933. For your interest and pleasure, we have enlarged the size of our paper, bringing features each week that are worthwhile. A review of news events of the past week, Brisbane, Washington Digest, State News, Paragraph, poultry column. I look forward to reading that every week. But I mean, I'm not really making light of it. The poultry industry was important in Montevallo as a sort of regional poultry center. And again, when we know of improved distribution networks, poultry probably wasn't just locally used. It could have been exported, certainly out of the Montevallo area. Pages of comics and others, a serial story starting soon, follow these features regularly. And so you start to see all the aspects of, I hate to say a modern newspaper, because modern is always in the eye of the beholder, but you see national stories, regional stories, you see various features, cartoons, and this is a week. All these papers, if you did not know, were weeklies. And maybe I should have done some of the comic strips here, but it's kind of running out of time in terms of what I wanted to show you. So I like some of these sort of Chamber of Commerce type advertisements. Trade with your hometown merchants. Your satisfaction is their first consideration. Convenience, quality, and economy be by trading at home. So the Montevallo Civic Hub and the Montevallo Commercial Club basically were having weekly sponsored ads in the Montevallo Times. A group ad you see it time to time, so obviously sometimes smaller companies or firms couldn't afford a larger ad themselves, so that collectively they would buy a space. And so this would be an ad you would see repeated quite often. And some of the retailers that you probably recognize, especially Whaley Furniture Company and a few others. Jeter Mercantile Company is still there in the 1930s. The Strand on the top left. And I have some more information on the Strand, because it's in 1935. The Strand, as we know it, actually reopened. So the building existed before, but there's a very massive remodeling to make it into a modern theater. And then here's a sort of slew of local automobile dealers. So in 1919, you only saw ones in Calera. So the Reed Motor Company for Chevrolet, Towery Motor Company. And of course, they're using a national ad and basically just putting their name. So this was not a locally produced ad. And then the $500 for a V8, my multiplier then was 15, so $7,500, doing math quickly in my head for a Ford V8 at this time. And then in honor of Carrie, who likes trucks, I found another one for a Ford V8 pickup. And again, quick period of time, when we're even just talking about wagons in 1970, 1919. And so pickup trucks are making their way to probably to the few people who could afford it during the Great Depression. Just local food ads I like, J.A. Brown with the Montevallo Grocery Company and their Crowell building. And then refrigeration, I just find that fascinating. That it's really the 1920s nationwide, you start to see electric refrigeration started. But in 1933, they are available. And in fact, part of the reason I show this is that Crosley's a Cincinnati company. I'm from there originally long ago. And so they were a fairly well-known electronics, radio, and home appliance manufacturer that eventually goes out of business post-Second World War. So they made their way down to Montevallo at this time. And certainly changing ways of life, where we know how much the refrigerator, and this is really thrilling, my students love when I give refrigerator history lectures. And there was people that had ice blocks and they were able to keep things cool in the past, or root cellars potentially to keep things cooler,
Let's not make fun of
but
that.
the sort of
Some us
convenience.
remember that.
Very hard.
Don't make fun of that, some of us remember.
I'm not making fun of it at all. I mean, I think this is a fascinating transformation.
There's a Crosley automobile,
Yes.
towards Alabaster on the left.
Oh, wow, that's
in front of
great.
a floral shop.
Wow. Later, I'd like to ask you exactly where that is. I'd like to take a look at that when I drive back.
How much is bananas?
Was it 5 cents a pound? I
4
think?
cents.
4 cents, and so multiplied by 15, 60 cents a pound, which is relative, I think, what they are today. Now, I looked at almost all the other prices adjusted for inflation. They're relatively the same today for most, at least, of these items. And so you could say, oh, those prices are so low, but in reality, they really aren't, if we can trust sort of the CPI statistics. And then I saw this, and boy, that looks, it doesn't look 1935 to me. It's a very clean ad, but it looks more 1950s than 1960s. And so what I really say, I mean, this is so different than the Crowell or the Maroney ads or the Brown ads, that this is a department store. That, I mean, I don't want to say big box store, but it's sort of Montevallo's equivalent during 1933. And you get a sense of sort of pretty wide variety and interesting prices. You can get your felt hat and pointy shoes there as well. I don't know. Is that like a knife shoe? No, I don't think so. But anyway, I can linger on some of these. I think there's only about 3 more to go here. And so Alabama Power, so rural electrification is taking place, and we can only imagine how much that's going to change the ways of life of so many people. And almost every edition, one sees ads for, oh, sorry about that. So hogs go higher, electricity stays down, but is that Freddie Kilowatt or Reddy Kilowatt?
Reddy Kilowatt.
Reddy Kilowatt, excuse me. And then for women who like to dig in the dirt, Alabama Power Company, and again, I won't read this to you if you want to look at these later, but,
What are they digging in the dirt for? Like
I think
laying
it's,
their own power?
I think it's gardening.
Garden.
When the first warm weather of sunshine of early spring brings swelling bud, obey that impulse to dig in the dirt, install electric range in the kitchen. That's kind of a non sequitur there. But anyway,
Remember, this was after Alabama Power bought, in the earlier ads you showed for Brown Ice and Power.
their local
They
power.
bought the power
Yeah.
generating, plant of Shelby that's still there from the Browns, and this is their first ads about that.
I mean, what a different world to now have this compared to what existed in the 1890s, pre-electrical. Doc's Barbecue, I guess, was not long because they were trying to sell it. And then Kent's Dairy Farm, that many of you are probably familiar with, that they were actually, they're taking over the route of another dairy farm. And so it's an attempted expansion.
They delivered in Montevallo.
Yes, delivered in Montevallo. And then in Almont, right next to Aldrich, is the Lewis Lawley Grocery. And again, we could multiply by 15 roughly in terms of their prices. Yeah. So all these are familiar, I can see to many of you here. And I think this is the last one. And so this was the announcement I just cropped in 1935. There was lots of excitement in the city as the Strand is getting ready to open. And then the grand opening Monday and Tuesday, Red Salute, Barbara Stanwyck, Robert Young, Cliff Edwards. No increase in admission, so they're holding the line on prices. And then something just totally different. I just love this ad. The Lee Amusement Company, which was a regional sort of carnival type firm in the South, will be in Montevallo the end of September. Merry-go-round, Ferris wheel, Charoplane, photo booth, novelties, and clean moral amusement. I like that. So I think that is it. So I hope we've provided some clean moral amusement for
Leave that up, our email addresses if you want to write to us. So, a link to the homepage. The homepage is the beginning point. It has everything we have been through, roots from that one page. And whether or not you're on Facebook, you can still follow us. Our page is pretty wide open, and that's where we post any sort of updates. We have a new batch of newspapers that we've just uploaded. For those of you who are in the middle of a dispute, we just uploaded the Governor of South Carolina's 1850s guide on dueling practices. So you can take care of your dispute legally and get clean moral fun. And all, but those sorts of just sort of general interest items and any sort of news announcements we post to social media.
Thanks very much, y'all. Very entertaining. For the sake of time, I'll let you address your questions to them as we enjoy the refreshments. But in closing, I'd like to recognize Clay. He has a couple of matters that he wants to take care of.
To follow up with what Kerry just said, links to all of their archives are available on the Historical Society website. So it's a very easy way to get to them. Just click on the button that says Online Archives and take you right to it. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Kerry for how great he's been with the establishment of the newspaper archive. I couldn't have asked for better help and assistance, and it's for me, my grandfather published a newspaper when I was a kid. I just figured that's just what he did for a living. But then now I realized he was writing the history of this town, and that's what we've done by establishing this archive. That you can learn a lot of things that you certainly did not know about Montevallo just by casually going from issue to issue to issue. I do it all the time, and it's just great fun. Some of you may remember that I did a presentation a few months back about Julia Ward Rottenberry's small memoir. And the Historical Society published a chapter of that memoir that was about her father. And at the time, I mentioned the books that her younger brother had written. His name was Robert David Ward. And I talked a lot about one book that he wrote that was called Time Has Made a Change in Me. And our friend Mrs. Binion here did the illustration for the cover. I'm glad that she's with us today. And but I also mentioned another book that he wrote that he wrote prior to Time Has Made a Change in Me. It was called Lamar and Me. And it's a wonderful little Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn kind of thing about two young boys growing up in Montevallo in roughly the late 30s, 1940s. And this book has been out of print for a long time. So as a result of the presentation that I made, I was able to establish contact with David Ward's, one of his daughters, who was actually at the presentation that day. And she and I have been conniving and working and doing this and that ever since. And we've managed to bring this book back to life. And I can announce today that it lives on the Montevallo Historical Society website today as a PDF file. So you can go to the website, you can read it on the website, you can print it, you can download it, whatever you want to do. And I've probably read it 5 times. I think I get something new out of it every time I read it. It's simple, straightforward, extremely well written, extremely well crafted, and great little stories. And if you grew up in Montevallo, you're going to recognize a lot of the places where they went here and there and performed all sorts of destructive behaviors. So it's a really great little book. So I'm just happy to be able to tell everybody that it's back in print, it's back available, and all you have to do is go to the website, and there it is.
Well, thank you, Clay, that's great.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Now, shifting gears slightly to another topic, I'm sure you've noticed all these photographs up front here. This is another a little brainstorm of mine that came from just a casual conversation with Pam Brown Fagan, who you probably all know is the chairman of the bicentennial that happened in 2017. She was telling me that when the new city hall was opened up, that a collection of photographs of the mayors had somehow disappeared. Nobody knew where they were. And so it just so happened that a few months before, Henry Emfinger, who's with us here today, had given me a personal tour of his mining museum in Aldrich. And I noticed that he had a pretty wonderful little collection of photographs of mayors of Montebello. And so a light bulb went off in my head, and talking to Pam, I said, well, those photos are at the mining museum. And it may not be the ones that you're looking for, but they're there. And so I got this bright idea to borrow Mr. Emfinger's collection of mayor's photos and reproduce them for the city. And thanks to Ann Thomas, who jumped in and helped me with this project, we were able to borrow the photographs from the mining museum. I worked my magic on them, and so this is the end result you see here. I've given a set of these prints to the city, so they have them, they can do whatever they want to. But it turns out that the originals in Mr. Emfinger's collection were not in the best condition. In fact, I damaged some of them just by trying to get them out of the original frames. So I just sort of put on the brakes and backed up and decided I need to be very, very careful about this. So it just occurred to me what I need to do here is to make a completely new set for him with good new frames, use archival paper, the whole 9 yards. And as I got into this, I was able to reuse many of his prints, but the ones that were damaged, I either repaired them or I found new or better versions than what he had in the first place. So that's what you see here. I'm going to be returning his originals to him, but he gets to take all these back to the museum, and they're all kind of resemble each other in a way, and so they can live again for visitors to his museum. And so, and this is all under the auspices of the Montebello Historical Society. So we're presenting him with these photographs today as thanks for him allowing us to use them. On top of that, as another way of thanking him, and this kind of goes to what Clark was just talking about. Fortunately, I have some graphics skills, and so I had noticed a very handsome ad for the Montebello Mining Company in some of the publications that you were talking about, particularly in Montebello Times and then the university yearbooks. So I reconstructed this particular ad out of one of those ads that you see in the newspapers and in the college annuals. And so he has this in the museum, but it's very small. And so I wanted to present this to him as well, so he can add this to everything he's got in the museum. And since this is the company that is the reason for the mining museum's existence, I think it's very appropriate for him to have this to add to all of this wonderful collection that he has there. So that's basically it. Now, I would love for all the officers and the directors who are here today to join us up front, and we can take a photograph with the Emfingers after we adjourn. Okay?
And we are adjourned. Thank you. Please enjoy some refreshments.
Want to see your reading part?
Dr. Sanders, I don't know if you're able to, but I'm taking across the one of your classes.
actually, what I was going to tell you is that's kind of what I'm going to pursue in my graduate PhD studies. Is I'm going to do the. I'm actually applying to schools right now, and I'm looking at the University of North Carolina, the University of Virginia, Auburn, and Alabama. So Jim's been helping me a lot with that. Yeah, well, I'm hoping. I am. So what I'm going to study is 20th century, rising 20th century and the history of technology. Because your class is so interested in kind of getting from point A to point B, because we study IBM, and to kind of see how that all came from an idea and how it ebbs and flows and things like that. I think that it's something that could really help me in the future too. So it's really, the history of technology and eventually that's what I can do. It is, absolutely. Right.
So why was he only made for a minute?
Right.
Yeah. Why was her granddad only made for a minute?
Well, I'm excited. Yeah, it's gonna be great. I'm a little sad because I've been doing my legal job. I've been working Bradley Abraham for about 5 years now. So basically, I work in ethics. So I've been doing that for 5 years, but I've been in the legal field for 14. So my father always thought, oh, we're going to law school. I was like, Dad, that's really not what I want to do. It's super fun. So your class inspired me, and then after that, I took one of Dr. Irwin's classes in public policy and environmental policy. So I took both of those. The tragedy of the I think you guys had us touch on was something we went back through when I was ready for in her class.
You know, I feel like
So, yes.
yeah. They weren't.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. How about your family? But you we're missing somebody here. 1910.
Well, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I was going to be meeting with a guy named Dr. David Simon at UVA, and he basically did his dissertation on capitalism and sugar. So, that's like his big thing. Like he teaches the history of technology, capitalism, and the environment. So I mentioned the course that I wrote to him and said, hey, I took this course, it was super interesting to me. I'd like to kind of apply that to modern day, politics and industry and all of that.
Well, for the family office.
Okay. Okay.
Except for me. Yeah.
Donna, I brought a check today. Sure, I'll take it.
Let's get all the work.
Yeah, I'm
Big Sugar as far as, you know, lobbying and the push and government involvement and all of that. I said, that's what she said. That's how I found out.
Yes, we're gonna have to have a
And
parking
he was
lot.
talking about like the role of lobbyists and government officials and kind of promoting and getting people to
Curious,
right?
that's a wide angle. The land might be able to get involved.
That's a little better, yeah.
Right. 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 Well, and I'm fascinated with cotton because that's kind of what gave us the boost here. You know, we were known for cotton, and yeah, so it's I'll definitely look at it. Thank you, and it was good to see you. Of course.
Try to get those.
I sure will.
Alright, y'all know the time.
Yeah, make us, yeah.
Yeah.